Good evening. Thank you guys for coming. Joy to have you all with us this evening. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Luke Wayne, one of the elders here at the Mission Church. And for those of you who do know me, one of the few things that I could guarantee anybody who's known me for any short stretch, even the shortest stretch of time, would know about me is that I am a history nerd. I absolutely love history. I love reading historical works. I'm like super nerdy about it. When I'm trying to decide whether to read a history book, one of the first things I do is flip to the bibliography. I'll spend a lot of time looking at what sources were cited, where they got their information, to know if I should even trust this thing. And so, if you've never bothered to look at a bibliography, you might not take a history book recommendation from me. It might not be as exciting to you. I'm nerdy about this stuff. I love history. But once in a while, you find a history author who can satisfy a nerd like me, and yet who also speaks to the not so nerdy person who just wants something interesting and compelling to read. It's rare. Normally, the guys with the thick bibliographies are unnecessarily dull in how they communicate their information. It's sad but true. I wish it wasn't. I like stuff to be interesting too. But oftentimes the stuff I want to read is not. But you find these special authors once in a while who can really nail it and write compelling yet accurate history. They don't embellish things to make them more interesting. They don't put little extra anecdotes in there, nor do they propagandize by slicing out all the uninteresting stuff and mixing it together to send their packaged message that doesn't really fit what happened. They're thorough, exhaustive in their work, informative, and yet compelling. David McCullough, a secular historian, he wrote a book called 1776, just about the first year of the American Revolution. And for me, this was such a book. I've known the story of the American Revolution since I was a young kid. I can't remember not knowing the basic story. And yet, reading this book, not only could I not put it down, I was on the edge of my seat, as if I didn't know what was going to happen. I knew we were going to win, but how? The whole time, on the edge of defeat, all the things that happen, everything going wrong. And then these extraordinary things that you can only call providential that suddenly occur and rescue the men who we look at as the heroes of our nation from certain defeat. And yet all of this is genuine, documented, real history, unembellished, raw fact, but presented so well that it speaks to the heart as well as the head. Now, today I want to open the Bible and look at what I think is one of the most extraordinary examples of this in all history. And that's the Book of Esther. If you guys will open up to Book of Esther, chapter 1. The Book of Esther is history. It's reporting true, accurate events that occurred in the time of the Persian Empire, during the Jewish exile, right at the end of the exile period, when some of the Jews were beginning to be able to come back to the land under Persian rule. You have this legitimate history telling real events about real people, and yet it's such an extraordinary story. So compellingly written, and written in such a way that you read it and you walk away able to apply the things that you've read to your life, knowing that it is spoken truth that isn't just a list of biographical facts and events, names and dates and things that happen, but it's food for the soul. Now, today, I'm not going to be able to dive in to all 10 chapters and everything that Esther has to say that we can benefit from and walk away from. The extraordinary life of this woman, Esther, and her family and her people under the oppression and exile that they're living in there in Susa, in the Persian Empire. I can't look at all of this. But I want to take one of the overarching themes that links this book together, one of the incredible literary achievements of the writer of Esther that makes this book so unique. And once we understand it, once we can see it through the eyes of the original audience, all those centuries ago, for whom this book was originally written, and see what it meant to them in their exact moment, in the things they were wrestling with, that my hope is that after tonight, you'll be able to go home and read this book yourself from beginning to end with fresh eyes, even if you've read it many times before, and see something new in what the Holy Spirit, through the author who wrote this, what they were doing here, and what this has to tell us, not just about history, but about the Lord and Master of history. The sovereign whose providence, whose guiding hand has shaped the events of all these thousands of years of human history, and especially of these events that were going on here. And so we're going to be sprinting through the book, pausing at a few places to read and think and discuss. Primarily a section in chapter 4 and then chapters 6 and 7 with a few highlights elsewhere. But my hope is that you'll come away with this not only with a better picture of history, but with a clearer view of God. Because that's what I honestly believe the author of this book wanted us to see. Which is ironic, because the literary device we're going to be looking at tonight is that this is the one author in all of Scripture who wrote the whole book without any direct reference to God at all. The name of God, Yahweh, Jehovah, the Lord, does not appear anywhere in this book, nor does the title God, nor any other euphemism for God, like the Most High, the Sovereign of the universe, the Lord of heaven. None of these titles, none of these ways of referencing God appear anywhere in this book. God is, in a sense, hauntingly absent from the words of this text, and yet, as we're going to see, also startlingly present in the events. And there's a very good and important reason for that. It was not accidental. It was not chance. Later generations have often looked back at this book and interpreted it as not even being intended originally to be a spiritual book. It was just meant to be a secular history, and later Jews and Christians spiritualized it. But as I hope you'll see, that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, we have ordinary histories from that time period written by Jewish hands and from the time period shortly to follow. And they don't do what this author did. You can't give a history of the Jews in that time period without mentioning their religion, their God, their life, because it was so central to the life of the people of Judah in their exile, in their homeland. But there's no mention here of the temple, no mention of their faith. The word prayer doesn't even occur. It is willful and carefully that the author has avoided making any direct reference to God, not because this is a secular history, but because there is a very, very sacred purpose in it. And the Jews in this time period needed to hear and recognize this reality. And that is, again, this was written a story about the Jews in exile. They had sinned against God repeatedly for generations, and God had finally, as he had promised to do through his prophets over and over again, he had driven them from the land and sent them into exile. He had cast them out of his presence, and yet he had promised he would bring them back. And here at the tail end of that exile period, as they have felt painfully the absence of God. God shows them, and the author of this book shows them, that God, in fact, has never been absent. In a very real and important way, God has been with his people, though hidden. The later Jewish rabbis who would compile the Talmud made an interesting wordplay connection, taking the word Esther, the name of the woman so prominent in this book, and paralleling it with wordplay to the Hebrew word Esther, which means to hide. And so they said that the Book of Esther is ultimately the fulfillment of prophecy, the prophecy in Deuteronomy 31:18, and I will surely hide my face in that day because all the evil that they have done, because they have turned to other gods. This was what was happening in the exile. Because of their idolatry, they had been driven from God's presence. He was hiding his face from them. And yet, he never left them. His promises never failed. And this is what we're going to see. So the book of Esther begins. There, the king of Persia has this great banquet in honor of his own glory and the glory of his empire. And he calls for his wife, the queen Vashti, to be called in to make a spectacle of her beauty before his associates. She refuses to come. He's outraged, and his advisors tell him this is going to lead to a spread of rebellion amongst, if the queen's wife can get away with this, then all the women are going to, so you need to act on this immediately. And so the Persian king gets rid of Vashti, drives her from his presence. She's no longer queen. And so they're seeking a new queen, and they call together all the beautiful women of the under the empire. And so Esther, too, a Jewish woman, though she hides her identity as a Jew under the careful instruction of Mordecai, her uncle. Her parents are gone. She's being cared for by her uncle. And so Mordecai warns her, hide that you're a Jew. You won't be treated equally or fairly if they know. Your Jewishness is something you need to hide and conceal. But go, and ultimately, Esther was apparently a very beautiful woman. I imagine she looks something like Ashley. But she also, as we'll see, God's hand and his providence was with them, though the text does not say that. And so of all the women in the empire, Esther is chosen to be the new queen. And so the king takes her as his bride. Shortly after this, there is a plot among some of the king's servants to assassinate him. Mordecai, Esther's uncle, discovers this. He exposes it, saves the king's life. Shortly after this, again, we're racing through some chapters here. Shortly after this, a man named Haman is promoted to be a high official under the king. Haman is walking through the town, and everybody is commanded to bow down and honor him and revere him, but Mordecai will not do so. And his only explanation is that he's a Jew, and so he will not bow down and honor this Haman. Haman is incensed, but he knows he can't get away with just dragging out and killing Mordecai. So he makes a plot to wipe out all the Jews in the Persian Empire. And by wiping out all the Jews, he'll get rid of Mordecai as well. Nice guy. And so, because of his wounded pride at this man who's unwilling to bow down and honor him, he's going to commit genocide against all the Jewish people. And so he convinces the king the Jews are a rebellious people, are threatening to him, and gets him to sign an edict that says on a certain day at a certain time that it will be legal for all the people of Persia in the Persian Empire to kill their Jewish neighbors and plunder their property. And the king agrees to this, signs it. And once a law is signed in the empire of the Medes and the Persians, the law is paramount. Even the king cannot change it. The king is not above the law. And so once the due process has been gone through and something is made a law, this cannot be changed. And so once this goes into effect on that day, and the day was determined by casting lots, it's seemingly random, the determination of what the day would be. But they determined the day, okay, and on that day, the Jews will be wiped out. Well, the Jews are grieving over this. And Mordecai, here we come to chapter 4, our first stopping point. Mordecai is going to Esther to tell her, you need to approach the king and do something about this. You need to go intercede for our people to your husband. And she's like, well, here's the thing. Even I, as his wife, as the queen, I cannot enter into the king's presence unless I'm summoned, because that's actually, under Persian law, a capital offense. If I walk into the presence of the king uninvited, he will put me to death. I'll be put to death unless, when I walk in, he gives a certain sign that makes an exception to that. And so, as we've seen, this king is subject to whims of emotion. He doesn't make very good judgment. He casts out his wife on a quick offense. He's ready to sign a law that's going to slaughter an entire people. She has reason to think he might not behave rationally if he's offended when she impudently walks into his presence when it is forbidden for her to do. She has reason to fear how this king might behave. But Mordecai says, chapter 4, beginning at verse 13, then Mordecai told them, they're sending messengers back and forth. Mordecai can't just walk in the palace and talk to the queen. So Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Notice the meticulous way that he uses passive voice to say what he's obviously saying here. If you don't go do this, then deliverance for the Jews is going to arise. From where? From where? Where does the guarantee come that deliverance from the Jews is going to arise? From God. That's obviously what Mordecai means. Yet the author is very careful to not say that. Likewise, he says, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? There's the idea here of a divine appointment. You have been put here in this place for this specific reason, for such a situation as this. This is the foreordained reason why you are queen. And yet, the author carefully phrases this in a way where God, the author of such fortune, the one whose purpose Mordecai is obviously saying she would be fulfilling, yet it's carefully written in such a way that God is not mentioned. Look just 2 verses later in verse 16. Esther's reply, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. And so we have the bold act of Esther here, as she does own up to the position that she's in and that she does need to do this. She does resign herself to do what is right. But first, she says, go and fast. Don't eat for 3 days. Don't eat or drink, and me and my women will do the same. Why? Fast for what reason? Did they believe that going hungry could itself manipulate events? Was this some sort of magical? No, obviously not. If we look at other writings from the time period, in Nehemiah, he's in a very similar situation in Nehemiah chapter 1, where he needs to go to a king of Persia and make a very specific request. And he says, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. What is fasting? It's a way of interceding to God for his help. Similarly, in Ezra, written during this time of Persia, Ezra 8:21, then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God to seek from him a safe journey for ourselves, our children, and all our goods. So they're about to go on a very dangerous trip. They were carrying valuables with them that would make them a target for bandits. And they stopped and they fasted. Why? To seek the favor of God. Daniel, also living under Persian rule, says in Daniel 9:3, then I turned my face to the Lord God, seeking him by prayer and pleas for mercy with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. Fasting is always paired with this idea of praying and seeking God's favor in these situations. Fasting is used in other times for an act of mourning or things like that. But in each of these contexts, when you're fasting for something because some big event or some need is right there, it's an act of interceding to God. And yet, uniquely among ancient Jewish literature, the author of Esther here phrases this in such a way that she simply says, go fast for me, without any mention of prayer, without any mention of God. What's he doing? They are appealing to God, and yet you are haunted by the absence of his name, by the absence of his mention. The ancient readers would have felt this. The ancient Jews reading this would have noticed this in a way we don't notice it. And we know that because only a few generations later, during the times of the Greek Empire, when times had changed and the sense of that absence of God in the exile was no longer a living memory, all those who had experienced that were dead and gone, the issues had changed. We have the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, produced. And the Greek translation of Esther adds references to God to this passage explicitly all over the place because they sensed the absence of it and felt the need to correct that, except it needed no correcting. The later generations noticed that God isn't mentioned there and yearned for him to be, felt like he should be. But outside of that sense of God's absence in the exile, they didn't recognize that that was the whole point. The author is grappling with this very idea. Has God abandoned his people? They've been driven from his face. He's hidden his face from him. They've been cast out of his presence. Has he abandoned them? And here they fast and cry out to. So Esther goes to the king. The king does give her the sign, making the exception. She is allowed into his presence. In fact, he rejoices that she's come to see him. Says, I'll give you whatever you ask, even half the kingdom. And she says, this is all I want. I want to have dinner with you and Haman. Remember Haman, the guy who got the law passed to wipe out her entire people? She says, I want to have this private banquet with just you, king, and Haman. So king agrees. Haman's feeling pretty good about this. Exclusive invitation within the royal family to this banquet. He's pretty enthusiastic about this. This is a very, very high honor in his mind. Meanwhile, you got to put yourself in Esther's position. She's got to keep her decorum up and handle this professionally when, to put this in a modern context, if you think about what's going on here, this man's motivation, she's just asked her husband, hey, can we have dinner with Adolf Hitler tonight? The guy who literally wants to wipe out my entire people, me, my family, my entire race, exterminate us. Can we have a party with him? Now, the king, of course, doesn't know any of this yet. And Haman doesn't realize that Esther's a Jew yet. She's hidden that fact. But this is where she would be at. But she does it. She goes in, she makes that invitation. They have the banquet. And the king realizes this banquet is a prelude for something. He's like, okay. But seriously, what is it that you want? Anything you want, just let me know. And she's like, well, what I want is to have another banquet. You, me, and Haman again, another banquet tomorrow. Let's do it. So the king agrees to that. Why the delay? Why doesn't she go ahead and act? Well, we don't know. The text doesn't tell us what Esther's reason was. But we come to discover what God's reason was. So Haman goes home that night feeling pretty great. He's been invited to an exclusive banquet, and now he gets to come to another one. He is in. The royal family loves him. He has the favor of the queen. He's getting dinners with the king. This is good times for Haman. But on his way home, he passes by Mordecai, who again refuses to bow down as he passes by. And he's so infuriated by this, he loses all the happiness and joy. He goes home and he's complaining to his wife. And his wife says, look, just build a set of, your translations will normally say gallows. It's not really hanging like we would think of hanging by the neck. It's a large pole on which the Persians would impale you, and you would hang there slowly bleeding out until you died in public view of all people, in agony and shame, as an example to others not to imitate your behavior. So she's like, go put up one of those, and tomorrow go get the king's permission and impale Mordecai, put him to death, and then you can go enjoy the banquet tomorrow night. You won't have to worry about it anymore. And Mordecai's like, yeah, that's a good idea. That's it. That's what I want to do. So then he goes to bed feeling good. Well, that night, we're going to pick up in chapter 6, and I want to read this part thoroughly because this is important. So what happens in 24 hours from Mordecai's plan? Mordecai's on top of the world. He's ready, or sorry, not Mordecai. Haman is on top of the world. Haman is ready to kill Mordecai. The rest of the Jews are going to get wiped out. He is in good with the royal family. Everything he thinks is going well for him. But then some things happen. So, chapter 6. On that night, the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Remember earlier I told you Mordecai had discovered the assassination plot on the king and had exposed it. And so he's the very night before Haman's going to launch his plan, the king suddenly has insomnia, can't sleep, and wakes up and he's like, okay, go get me the Chronicles and start reading them to me. I don't know if he just thought the Chronicles were boring enough that maybe that'd help him get some sleep, or if he's deciding to get some work done, but they're reading to him from the Chronicles, and they get to the story of what Mordecai did, saving him from this assassination plot. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's young man who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." And the king said, "Who is in the court right now?" And so here it is, early in the morning, and who's getting up eager to go get permission to put Mordecai to death? Now Haman just entered the court, at that exact moment, just entered the court of the king's palace to speak with the king about having Mordecai hanged or impaled on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" So Haman hasn't got to say anything yet, but the king first greets him with this question. And of course, Haman, being the humble, selfless man that he is, Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" So Haman's immediately thinking, all right, I get to pick my own honor here. What would I want the king to do for me? Oh, this is going to be awesome. Okay. So Haman said to the king, "Well, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head the royal crown is set. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus is to be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horses, exactly like you just said. And you, since you're one of my trusted officials, you go do that for Mordecai." The very honor he was hoping for, he now has to go do for Mordecai, parading Mordecai through the streets and shouting his praises to all the people. Everything's beginning to unravel. "Hurry, take the robes just as you've said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king delights to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." Now, once again, who awoke the king from his sleep? Why is it that Haman was walking through the door at exactly the right moment? Exactly the right moment to be the one put in this position so that the enemy of God's people would be shamed and forced to honor them. Who was it? Who was it that arranged every moment of this? Nothing miraculous happened. A sleepless night is not a miracle. A coincidence of someone walking in at just the wrong time is not a miracle. And yet, that all of this would happen in precisely this way, and this is only the start, God's hidden work. Not great signs and wonders like in the days of Moses, but his hidden hand favoring his people, delivering them, though he has hidden his face from them, is beautifully at work throughout this whole text. And again, here at the end, oh wait, if this Mordecai that you're going up against is of the Jewish people, oh, you're certainly going to fall. What would lead someone to think that? Is it that the Jews are outwitting them? No, they haven't planned any of this. Esther, Mordecai, for all their efforts, have not engineered a single thing that has happened in all of this. So far, the most Esther has done, she was bold and faithful, but the most she's done is ask Haman and the king to dinner twice. She's yet to act, but already everything is coming to place entirely outside of their control. And even the enemies of God's people recognize that the God of Israel is a great and mighty God. That is what is to be feared. There is nothing in the human characters that was bringing Haman down, and everyone knew it. The author carefully hides the names and titles of God, as God had hidden his face from his people, and yet his hand is at work. Did Mordecai or Esther know that any of this had happened at the time? Virtually none of it. Yet God was at work. And so, chapter 7, again, we're going to read this all, and then we'll quickly race through the rest and wrap up at the end. So the king and Haman went to the feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to half my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who has dared to do this thing?" And Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, the wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. So this impulsive king has heard this, he's drunk, and in his anger right now, he's stormed out of the room. You're not going to reason with him. And so Haman does the only thing that he can do. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Now we know what's really happening here. Haman has come over to the king and fallen down beside her to beg mercy. But what does the king see when he walks in the room and finds Haman over falling down on the couch of his wife? And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. So the servants of the king seize Haman and basically essentially put a bag over his head and bind him at this exact moment, right when he might have been able to explain himself, try to defend what was really going on there. At that exact moment, his face is covered. He doesn't get to answer. But someone else gets to speak at that moment. So now he knows that the queen and her people were going to be massacred by the command of Haman, by Haman's scheme. He now believes that Haman was going to assault his wife. And then on top of all that, then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, moreover, and another thing, the gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. So one of the king's servants chooses this moment to bring up, oh yeah, by the way, Haman built this huge thing to impale Mordecai. You know, the one who saved your life? Yeah, that's standing 50 feet high to murder and shame the guy who saved you. The man who the king delights to honor, Mordecai's going to kill him. Just thought I should bring that up. And the king said, hang him on it. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king was abated. So, the king's impulsiveness suddenly turns to Esther and Mordecai and the Jews' favor. As he comes in, angry and drunk, jumps to the wrong conclusion, Haman never gets to defend himself, and right at that moment, one of his servants also informs him of Haman's plan to murder the guy who saved him. And all of this together leads to Haman being publicly executed. Even here, where Esther has taken a stand and said, this is what I've come to ask you for, King. Save me and save my people from this wicked plot. Even then, what the king did was not only in reaction to her words. All of a sudden, a series of events entirely out of her control happened back to back to drive the king to act. And that action punished and eliminated this great enemy of God's people. But this genocidal, wicked man received his just punishment. But there was another problem. Haman's law could not be changed. Not even the king could say, never mind, on the day that the lots indicated, you're not allowed to kill the Jews. The law was already signed and into action. And so, the king did something else. First, he promoted Mordecai to Haman's position, put the signet ring on him. And then they drafted a law, another law. The king can make more laws. He can't revoke the old ones, but he can make new ones. And so, in Esther 8, 10 through 12, and he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud. So they've written a law and they're sending it out to all the people, saying, so this is going to the Jews in every corner of the Persian Empire, that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, and to destroy and to kill and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that would attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month of the month of Adar, which is the exact day that Haman had already established the Jews could be killed. So what's this law saying? Okay, yes, you know what? The law says you can attack the Jews. But the Jews can defend themselves, and not just at home. They can get together and organize into a military force to defend themselves. And if you attack them, they will not be considered murderers for defending themselves. And if you attack the Jewish people to slaughter them, and they, defending themselves, kill you, they get to claim your belongings. Now they get your stuff. You were killing them to take their stuff, they get yours. And so a lot of people, you might imagine, were deterred from taking action to try to plunder the Jews when they realized the Jews were going to be allowed to be a one-day military. Normally, an empire wouldn't let a subjugated people gather together armed within their own cities. That's dangerous. That can lead to rebellion. But he said, for this one day, you guys can do it. You can gather together, arm yourselves, organize, protect your women and children, defend yourselves, and if anyone is foolish enough to attack you, you get to plunder them. Now, some people were still foolish enough to attack them, but God gave his people victory. They defended themselves, they struck down their attackers, and God prospered his people in the land, or in the land of their exile. And so in chapter 9, 20 through 22, we read, and Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies. They just got relief. Doesn't mention where they got it, who gave it to them. You know. And as the month that had been turned from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days of sending gifts of food and to one another, and gifts to the poor. So here we see, one, notice there was no prophet here revealing a divine command. This is just God's people decided every year we're going to celebrate what God did. And we're going to celebrate by giving gifts and feasting. So as a minor point we can take from this, Christmas is okay. When we see God's done extraordinary things, celebrating that every year, biblically we see that happen. But more importantly, what's going on here? Again, they celebrate what? That their sorrow was turned. Again, the magic of passive voice that your word processor won't let you use. But here, it's used beautifully, powerfully, to mention what God has done without saying his name. And so the story concludes here. So they feast in celebration and continue to year after year that they have been delivered. Their God has delivered them. And this is precisely what the people in that day needed to be reminded. You may not have a Moses moment parting the sea and bringing you all at once out of captivity and back to your land right now. God is not keeping his promise in that way, and yet he has not forgotten you. Even in the days of your exile, when you were made to feel alone and hidden from your presence, that was your punishment, and it was right. His face was hidden from you. And yet, in a way, it was hidden in plain sight. God never actually left them. God was delivering them. His providence beautifully working to weave normal human events together in an unexpected tapestry of deliverance. God rescued them. And this was written to show them that. We see in a prophet not very long after this, the last of the prophets in the actual Old Testament text, the last book in the way we arrange our books in the modern Christian canon, the book of Malachi, who opens his book speaking to this same yearning, same questioning, same wrestling in the hearts of his readers. The book of Malachi begins, I have loved you, says the Lord, but you say, how have you loved us? This is what they were wrestling with. I have loved you, says the Lord, and yet this generation, looking around, still under Persian rule, many back in the land by this time, but not independently so. Enemies still around them. How have you loved us? How have you loved us, God? God answers, was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord. Yet I have loved Jacob, but Esau I have hated. I have laid waste his hill country and left his heritage to jackals in the desert. If Edom says, we are shattered, but we will rebuild the ruins, the Lord of hosts says, they may build, but I will tear down. And they will be called the wicked country, the people with whom the Lord is angry forever. Your own eyes will see this, and you yourself will say, great is the Lord, even beyond the borders of Israel. Again, this doesn't speak to us the way it did to them. He just spent most of his answer talking about the judgment he brought on a neighboring nation. How does that answer their question? Because Jacob and Esau were brothers. Edom and Israel, their descendants, these two nations side by side, both were conquered by Babylon, both ruled by Persia, yet now two very different situations. God has crushed Edom, and Edom will never rebuild. They continued to limp along as an existing people group, but never became a kingdom again. The Edomites for a few hundred more years until finally they fell to the Hasmoneans and were scattered and never gathered together again. They weren't all put to death, but they intermarried with other peoples. They spread out, and there were no more Edomites after that. But that didn't happen. That didn't happen to Israel. That didn't happen to the Jews. How have you loved us? You're still here. I have preserved you. I've brought many nations under judgment, and they never recovered. But not so, Judah. Not so with you. I have loved you. And even when you haven't seen it, even when you've suffered, even when you've been under the rod of my correction, you have been preserved. My hand has secretly been with you. This is what Esther was all about. Calling Judah back to faith and trust in the God whom they had sinned against, who had sent them into exile, and yet was now beginning to bring them home, to whom they owed more than they realized. And just like Malachi, the author of Esther wanted them to see, even in your darkest times, God's hand was with you, working things out, carrying you through to his purposes to ultimately bring you back to himself. So much more we could say, but we're long out of time. So what's our takeaway here as believers today? Well, first, that God is reliable, that he keeps his promises, that God is faithful and trustworthy, even when his promises seem to conflict with each other. One promise that God made is that when you turn from me, I will hide my face from you and cast you out. You read it as far back as Deuteronomy, you read it through the prophets, and yet at the same time, God promises, even when you forsake me, I will not forsake you. How could God keep both these promises? Esther shows us how he does it, how he can do both. As New Testament believers, we see this in an even more glorious picture in the gospel itself. How God can keep his vow and promise to punish every sin, and yet can also keep his promise to forgive and deliver. How can he do both? The cross. How can God send a Messiah who is both a suffering servant, who comes meek and lowly riding on a donkey, and yet who is also comes on the cloud of heavens to claim the kingdom, and all the peoples of the earth will bow down and worship him? How can the Messiah be both? Read the New Testament. God presents us with promises that sometimes seem to be in conflict with each other, but they're not. He fulfills them all and does so beautifully. Esther is a great picture of that. We can trust God in all that he says. And even in our darkest times, we have the words of our Lord, that lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And we can rest in that. We can trust that no difficulty, no heartbreak, no challenge, no suffering will ever undo that promise. He has a purpose in our worst of times. There's more I say, but I think that's the best place I can stop. So maybe the time will come in the future where we'll get a chance to preach through this whole book verse by verse. Lord willing, I hope we get there. There's so much more to see. But what I hope you can walk away from this today with is a bigger picture of the God of Esther, so that we can trust in that God in all areas of our life. And so perhaps, again, you can read this book yourself and see the subtleties of his providence and know that the same God who was sovereign even over the choices of random people throughout the story of Esther is sovereign today. We can trust him.